Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Bret. This is my channel. And just about every week, you can see me on here talking about DevOps, Docker, containers, Kubernetes, cloud native, all those things, all those buzzwords. And that's where this is the place to be. On Thursdays, you should be here next week, the same time. If you're not watching this live, then come back on a Thursday and subscribe to the channel, and you'll see notifications about when I go live, and I usually have guests. And just like this week, we have a very special guest from all the way a couple hours south of me in North Carolina. I have Nirmal Mehta, Docker Captain. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Bret, how are you doing today?
Good. We have been friends for quite some time. 3-4 years as Docker Captains?
2015.
Yeah. It was Seattle?
So, yeah, like 5 years now.
That's a long time ago. So, yeah, Nirmal and I met in the Docker Captain program, which Docker kind of created in 2015, I think it was, 2015 era. And we met at the conference. And this is sort of a great example of why you want to go to conferences. You go to conferences to meet cool people like Nirmal and get to hang out with some of the smartest people in the world instead of going into all the lectures, which are just really videos that you can watch on the internet. Now, those are obviously one of the big draws, but I go for the community. I go back for the community and meeting new people. And here we go, 5 years later.
Yeah. And the coolest person I met is definitely Bret Fisher. And I'm not just saying that.
I'm looking forward to when he's on the show. So,
can I just say something, Bret?
Yeah, absolutely.
I rocked through your Kubernetes mastery course in 2 days. I just sat there, and it is by far one of the best Kubernetes classes to take. I learned all these little nuggets of details I did not know about Kubernetes, and it's like bite-sized. It's like those like not the really small ones you get for Halloween, but like the really good full-size candy bars. Not the king size. That's too much. That's like 30 minutes of content.
Yeah, the course isn't quite king size yet.
No, it's like 10-minute like full-size candy bar chunks. It's great. And I really encourage anyone who's listening to us to take your class and your course on Udemy. It's
wow,
awesome.
that's a fantastic advertisement. Can I reuse that? I'm gonna have to put that everywhere on billboards. Nirmal said, "Yeah, well, thank you." And in fact, we're launching the next section next week. So Nirmal and I actually were talking about before the show that the Ingress section is going to come out next week because we're adding big chunks of it as we go. Because honestly, you could talk for 50 hours of training about Kubernetes, and you still wouldn't be done. So, there's a lot.
Yeah, and that's the only thing that I was disappointed about was that it didn't keep going on forever.
Yeah.
I'm super looking forward to your next bit of content on the Udemy class, and I will devour it as fast as I can.
Well, thank you. I will certainly keep you posted. For those of you on the chat that have taken one of the courses, thank you so much as well. But this show is now sponsored by my Patreon page. So in addition to the courses, we're now, because we want to release more of this free content, like we're going to talk about Ingress today, we wanted to figure out a way to make this continue beyond just a year, right? We'd love for the show to go on as long as possible. And one of the ways we can do that is by getting a little money from it. And we could go out and get ads and sponsors, and we've tried that before, but I thought, hey, maybe we could just ask the community to pick up the tab a little bit. So hopefully this works out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the content that you're going to be publishing. I believe you just published a podcast today, if I'm not mistaken.
I did. So thank you for being a patron. Nirmal was one of the first. I think he was the second one to jump on the wagon for Patreon.
I wasn't the first one.
No, I'm sorry. Oh,
it's all good.
We can change history. We can say you're the first one if it makes you feel better. Well, okay. So if you didn't know who Nirmal was, let me talk a little bit about him real quick. Obviously, we said he's a Docker captain, but he's been working at Booz Allen for a while now. He's a chief technologist there, and he's also been on the cover of magazines as a Hollywood-looking star. You should check that out on the internet, somewhere around his Twitter profile. Very handsome guy. and he loves dogs and his dogs have their own Instagram account, as all dog owners should.
Yep.
And what are their names again?
Starla and Abby,
Starla.
Starla, and Abby, Abbey. So Starla.Abby is their Instagram account, and check it out. They're cute little pups, and if you like dog pictures on the internet, give us a like on there.
Yeah, and you have one of the cutest dog beds I've ever seen, which is a Game of Thrones sword. What is it called? The sword throne?
It's the Iron Throne.
Iron Throne, right.
Yeah, so it's something that my partner Kristen cooked up in an evening. She built that for our dogs because they're absolutely the queens of the household. And there's now 2 heated blankets in the bottom of that dog bed that keeps them nice and warm because little dogs are all about warmth.
Yeah. In fact, here we go. You look at the.
Oh, there we go.
These are the puppies we're talking about. This is going to turn into a puppy show someday.
Oh man, I think our view count just probably went up.
They look like they could be, long lost siblings.
Yes, they're separate rescues. We rescued them at separate times, but they couldn't be closer together.
Yeah.
Ooh, I got a little glimpse of something we're going to be talking about in just a little bit.
As a teaser. So,
yes.
So tell us a little bit about what you do. Like,
Sure.
I know you work a lot with customers, but like, what's going on?
Yeah, so I'm a government consultant contractor with Booz Allen Hamilton and focus mostly on the public sector. And my primary role is figuring out what's coming up next in the cloud digital space, software development space, and emerging technologies, and translating that, from what's coming out there in the next year or two, and translating that to our customers, our customer base and the solutions that they're looking for, or anticipating what solutions they want in the future. Out of that, in this role, in the past 2 iterations of this role, I was lucky enough to be on the cloud computing wave early on. So I started using Amazon Web Services before they had the user interface, if you remember those days. Eucalyptus, if that rings a bell, 3-tera AppLogic, and bursting out from virtualized data centers to the public cloud at that time, which was mostly just Amazon. Back in the 08 timeframe, 09 timeframe. And then the second wave I hit, which was really awesome, was seeing this presentation by Solomon at OSCON in July 2013, right after Docker was open sourced, and my mind was blown in this little session at 8 a.m. on a Friday morning at OSCON, and after that, the minute I saw the demo from Solomon, I knew that this containerization, Docker-oriented containerization technology, as opposed to jails and zones and other, like technology back in the day, that this Docker technology was going to really take off. And it was like a glimpse of the future. And a year later, I helped win a contract with the General Services Administration where we integrated Docker technology, Docker Swarm, and I believe we're the first paying customers of Docker's registry, DTR at that time, to provide a platform as a service, containers as a service for that customer. And that kind of just took off from there. And since then, I've worked on lots of different emerging technologies, including virtual reality, augmented reality, machine learning, and supporting customers with enterprise architecture, solutioning, and all kinds of stuff. Getting into the nitty gritty with different technologies. So this last iteration, this past year, was kind of looking at writing white papers and analyzing things such as service meshes, graph databases, machine learning operations, things like that. So that's me in a nutshell.
That's a lot.
Yes.
When we look back over our careers in tech, it's like
I know.
there's some jobs where we're stuck doing the same thing forever, and there's some jobs where you're just in a race to keep up, and
Yep.
that sounds
Yep.
like what you're in.
Yeah. Sometimes I get called in to kind of help, um, you know, assist with configuration and getting things done. Quote unquote capital getting things done on the terminal, configuring stuff, and then sometimes it's strategy and other kinds of work like that.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
So
Sounds
part of that is this ingress controller stuff, right? This
yeah.
nitty gritty of this. Ugh.
Well, and a lot of this stuff, it's like we just keep pushing pushing the problems out, and one of the challenges with Kubernetes is um, it doesn't know when it needs to stop integrating, and it's not actually anything to do with the Kubernetes project, right? It's to do with the fact that they made a great API that everyone wants to use. So we get into this scenario where you go to the CNCF landscape, and you have hundreds of different options for things, that integrate with Kubernetes, and you think you need to do them all, and you don't.
Yeah, I think just to step back one step, I know that you've supported a lot of different enterprise customers in your career as well, Brett. I think when it comes to storage and networking, that's where common architectures and common abstractions just start to go. They start to kind of expand,
Yeah.
really become customized at that point. And um, no matter how many times I've heard customers think that they're different, where they are legitimately different is typically storage and networking. And Ingress controller, Ingress, the Kubernetes kind of interface there is the location where that starts to differentiate from one solution to another. And I think that's where the rough edges are, right? Because it can't fully be abstracted, if you will.
Yeah. And a lot of this stuff is not built in. And one of the great things about the Kubernetes project is that they don't have the not invented here syndrome, which is the attitude of, well, we need to solve a problem, and our software doesn't yet do that, so let's make software to do that. And instead, what they decided was, like all modern open source software that's successful, they made a great API and started making standards for specifications that others will use to make their software work. So in the case of Ingress, which we should probably just define what it is, but in the case of Ingress, there is no out-of-the-box solution. You have to go choose one, and that immediately makes it challenging for everyone because they don't necessarily know any of those products. And the same is true with networking. And this is one of the reasons why I always advocate, if you're going to have to run your own Kubernetes, that you choose a distribution. And that distribution will have opinions and setups for almost all of these things. So you don't have to go survey the market. You just use what the vendor that you've chosen uses. So that's what I tend to recommend. So let's talk a little bit about what Ingress is, right? There's when we talk about Ingress in Kubernetes, I like to use a capital I Ingress because that's a built-in feature of Kubernetes, right? But really,
It's a resource.
yeah, but really, we've all in tech been talking about ingress and egress for decades now, and it usually comes down to networking and firewalls. But the reality is, if you go look at the definition of the word ingress, it really just means to enter a room.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a tech word. Now, I didn't hear of it until I was in tech, but it's not a tech word specifically. And we've all been dealing, whenever you have to bring things in through a firewall or allow things into your network, you'll usually hear networking Cisco people talk about ingress, or maybe your proxy people. But those of us that are like sysadmins or developers, we maybe didn't hear that word a lot until Kubernetes. I just want to make sure that we know it's not a Kubernetes specific word. They're just deciding that for them, the capital I ingress is a feature that's specific to HTTP protocol. So it's only about web apps and web APIs and stuff like that. So that narrows this conversation down a lot, right? So if you're just dealing with databases and other things, then you're not going to be dealing with the built-in ingress feature.
Yep. And it's as you know, one can just put a node port or a load balancer service type resource on, your deployment or in your yeah, I guess in your deployment or
Yeah.
as a service, right? As a service type. And what gets confusing is if you pick something like node port or load balancer, or even some of these other ones, like even well, not external, but definitely node port or a load balancer, it seems like that should be good enough for what, that should be like kind of the end of where Kubernetes is. And then the rest is like kind of up to you. And then there's this ingress, which adds that like layer, like application layer abstraction for the same thing that load balancer is doing for any type of protocol, correct?
Yeah.
or node port it's doing for any type of protocol. So there's kind of like this not blurry line, but it starts to get a little, that's the level of where things get complicated.
Yeah.
Because like ingress in Kubernetes world ties specifically to how you're designing your application, as opposed to all these other resources where it doesn't really matter what your application really is. It could be a database, so long as it's exposing itself over some port, and it could be whatever protocol you want to have. It doesn't really matter. But once you get to ingress or an ingress controller and the blurry lines between those two things as well, how you're designing your application, what you're doing in your application matters all of a sudden. And it goes from being very abstracted to becoming not that much abstracted. And I think that's where it gets thorny.
Yeah.
And then there's all the features that you expect from a load balancer isn't necessarily in service type load balancer. And those features are actually in whatever ingress controller you pick, essentially.
Yeah. So if you have like the simplest setup, right? If you're deploying web apps to Kubernetes, that you didn't have to have a custom proxy in front of it with a bunch of different, URL translation rules or, any of the sort of advanced getting into the API gateway realm of kind of functionality, then you can probably get away without using ingress. Because the reality is if you're running in the cloud, you're in a cloud that has a load balancer hardware function outside of your server, right? And you're probably going to use that anyway, because you're going to need multiple nodes to be fault tolerant, and you're going to need something in front of those nodes. So you're probably going to have a load balancer. And so one of the models, definitely, like if we look at AWS, is when you create a service for your apps, that service gets its own dedicated load balancer, like the load balancer node type, and that's an AWS load balancer. And you're just creating each one of those for every app that needs to be public. And that's a working model. That works great. You can completely avoid ingress and that extra hop of traffic and worrying about which proxy to choose and all that stuff. You can definitely avoid that. And I'm all about simple. So if you can keep from needing this extra layer of functionality and feature set, then by all means. I think as you get more complex and maybe as you're starting to bring in old code, like you're bringing in older systems to integrate with your new systems, or maybe you're dealing more with microservices now where you have all these endpoints, that doesn't really scale because not a lot of people want 100 AWS load balancers, and they'd rather have like 5.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think the ingress starts to make sense, right? Where we are having the first hop be the cloud physical load balancer, and that's on port 80443, so it's a common port URL there. And then that's sending to a port on your servers, whether it's port 80 on your servers doesn't really matter at that point because you still have that hardware in the front. And so you can choose a high port, like port 30,000 or something. And the key there is that one hardware load balancer in the cloud is pointing to that one IP address across all your nodes that you want to have traffic. And that's where the ingress can then start doing your routing. You can start making these ingress resource rules that say, hey, for website A, go to this pod. For website B, go to this pod. One of the things I learned in developing part of the course is I didn't realize when you choose to use ingress, it technically avoids the service IP. So it doesn't use whatever service. If you created a cluster IP in the service or a node port, it actually avoids that and goes directly to the endpoint pods so that it doesn't have an additional hop. It just goes. So if you went and looked at the Nginx configuration, Nginx is one of the choices for an ingress proxy. And if you went and looked at its configuration after you set it up in Kubernetes, if you had multiple pod replicas, you would see the pods themselves. in the list of Nginx. So it's technically sending the traffic directly to them, which is nice because it doesn't add another layer of hops to the service. It just replaces that service hop.
And I think that maybe we'll get to kind of best practices or some ideas around best practices later. But one thing I heard was to make sure that you scope your ingress and your ingress controllers so that it doesn't, so it's scoped to a specific namespace.
Yeah.
And because by default, it's all namespaces. And if you, because of what you were just talking about, that it's using the pod IP addresses, if you have a lot of pods going, then that Nginx config can become so big that it actually takes too long for it to, every time a new pod or something changes or a new event, it updates that whole, it does a reload on that whole entire Nginx config.
Yeah.
And if it gets too big, that gets so long, or it takes so long to reload that, that it can affect the performance of your cluster essentially.
Yeah.
And so one best practice is for the default ingress controller is to scope it to the namespaces that matter for whatever you're doing, and to kind of make sure that you know your boundaries. And I think one other part of that is, as opposed to, you were mentioning before, like just using ELBs or not having to use ingress at all. The one use of ingress is to capture your application's routing rules, proxy kind of configuration with the other configuration elements of the deployment of your application. So if you're a microservices team, your team is responsible for this service, and there's another one pizza team that's responsible for another service. Their ingress resources are defined and controlled by them versus maybe a networking team that just runs the ELBs for the whole entire cluster of resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that gets into a mode where you're really talking about, you start to get complicated really fast, right?
Yes.
Because what we all ideally want, or we think we want, and maybe we shouldn't do it, is we have different teams all using the same clusters, but we want their permissions controlled so that their RBAC is only giving them the ability to do certain things. And one of the challenges with ingress is if you and I can both ship code and change ingress routes on the same cluster, then I could probably stomp all over your routes. So I could make a rule that says, if you make a rule that says website.a.com/Nirmal goes to this specific pod, and then later I go, oh, well, I want website A, any route to go to my pod, there's a big risk there around the route ordering and permissions of who has what routes. And so that, I didn't even get into that in the course yet, because I feel like that is not a day one problem or a day two problem, right? Like that's...
That's like a negotiation between two services, team, SRE kind of problem.
Yeah, I mean, your first Kubernetes deployment should not probably be trying to tackle that, where you're, making sure that any rogue person in the teams can be protected from other people's stuff. Really, at the end of that day, if you're starting out and you want to lower that risk, just make different Kubernetes clusters. Maybe that's a possibility for you, one for each team, and then as you grow, you get them bigger and more of a monolithic cluster that manages more of the teams.
And on that note, and this is, I read briefly, I have not done this myself, but you can run multiple ingress controllers scoped to different selectors, essentially, or whatever.
The
selector of the class selector for the ingress resource. So you could have a situation where you have a shared cluster and multiple ingress controllers that have different feature sets, maybe the default one that comes with, vanilla Kubernetes, or the one that comes with your distro, and another one, or one that's configured, the same one, but configured differently, that has a selector on different ingress resources, maybe department A versus department B or something like that, or product 1 versus product 2. So there's a lot of permutations of this. That's a very advanced kind of topic around this, but it's and I know the joke in the container world is it's proxies all the way down, but this is it. This is where all the proxy craziness starts to happen.
Right. Right. Well, we don't want to talk about service mesh yet because that's more of a much more advanced topic. But that's where it really gets crazy, where you have proxies for every one of your pods. But um,
To be fair, that the line between ingress controller, ingress resources, load balancers, API gateways, and service meshes is blurring very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of the confusion is going,
yeah.
coming from.
So when we start talking about, so like step one, right,
Yes.
is you've decided that you don't want a bunch of cloud load balancers in front of your cluster, and you would rather have your cluster have a single port for a lot of its public websites or web apps or APIs or anything speaking HTTP, right? So that's kind of like the first reason that people start to look at Ingress as the Ingress resource. Then they go look at the documentation, and then they see that there's only one officially supported one, which is the Nginx version of an Ingress controller. And when we talk about Ingress, there's two main parts. There's, the third one would be your app. You actually have to have apps to put on Ingress. But the first part is the controller, which doesn't come out of the box. You have to pick one. There's at least a dozen. And then you make an Ingress resource, which is the routes. Those are the rules that any one of your ingresses can use. And that part that Kubernetes project wanted to standardize was the routing. They wanted to be able to make a single YAML resource manifest that you could use regardless of whether you chose Nginx or Traffic or Glue or Ambassador or Conquer or Kong or like a ton of other options. They wanted it to where you could make that resource, and then if you moved from one Kubernetes cluster to another, or maybe you have an internal cluster that uses Nginx, but the internet you use Traffic or whatever, they wanted that resource to stay the same. So that resource is usually very small. The spec of it is one of the smallest. It's one of the smallest specs of all the resources in Kubernetes. It's actually pretty narrow. And so today, one of the things I had to learn from others like Jerome and Betty in the community, that we're kind of calling that version 1. The technical API version is V1 beta 1 of that resource. And that is the first attempt. We can all use that to start out with, but as you get more advanced, you're going to wish that spec did more things. Like maybe it did some 301 redirects, or it did some URI
Rewrites.
translation, or rewrites the URL. So those sorts of things don't fit in the spec. The nice thing is they kind of knew that going in, and they said, okay, well, any of this extra stuff that your proxy may do that we need you to, that you want to add in, you can add into the metadata as an annotation. And annotations in Kubernetes are just blank metadata. It doesn't really understand what's going on in there in terms of the stuff, in terms of the API rather. It just passes that to your controller proxy, and you hope that it works. And that's, I think,
it's almost like a dependency injection in Java.
Yeah,
it has that same vibe to it.
It's one of those things where you can't depend on Kubernetes to keep you safe. So I think that's one of the big rubs with it, is that you end up with all these annotations that even if one character is off, there's no error checking until it's in your proxy, and then your proxy starts spitting out log errors. In fact, in making the course videos for this stuff, I was throwing in some annotation samples, and I kept doing them wrong, and the proxies would not, basically they looked like they didn't update, and so I'd have to go look at their logs and see that they were complaining about some format. But that's the problem with using annotations, is if we were using an actual Kubernetes spec, then the CLI would check it, make sure that your keys and values were correct, or at least your keys would be correct. And so the community as a whole, this isn't actually clear from the documentation, the community is starting to, when I say the community, I mean the community of Ingress controllers, the Traffics, the Ingresses, the Envoy proxies, and all that stuff. They're slowly moving away from the built-in Ingress controller to a custom resource definition, so a CRD.
Ingress. Oh, okay, so away from Ingress controllers, not just Ingress.
Well, so technically, they are running their Ingress controller against a custom Ingress resource. So they're no longer using so when you type in your YAML and you're typing in the kind would be normally Ingress. Now that's going to be something else. It might be Ingress route or I think Ambassador calls it something else.
So
Anyway,
each one of those Ingress controller projects and / vendors is defining their own custom Kubernetes resource that encapsulates the current Ingress, capital I Ingress resource plus something
right,
else.
that's exactly right. That's
Defined
what we
by-
should call it,
defined by
Ingress
them.
plus plus.
Well, defined by them though.
Right.
And without now, is there a so um I'm just going to try to get this out of the way so that
Yeah.
we can keep talking about it. There's an inherent tension here, right?
Yep.
Which is
Yep.
um, the Kubernetes community and the spec wants to standardize what's in that definition so that there's portability and that there's all that stuff that you talked about, validation, um, standardized YAML. You can send it to I can send you something and it would run on your cluster kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But the tension then is that the vendors want to differentiate as much as possible because they're competing against each other, and they want to have their feature set be the differentiation point, and that comes down to how they want you to define how to run their proxy, right? Their ingress control, custom resource defined ingress controller substitute.
That's right.
And so is that inherent tension going to be resolved at some point in the CNCF and Kubernetes communities, or is that just Wild West and that's just going to be it?
Yeah, I
Good luck.
I don't think that that will ever perfectly be resolved. I think we're always going to deal with well, if you want these extra features, you either have to use an annotation with the built-in ingress or go get a CRD. But what I do think is going to happen, and one of the maintainers, the SIG maintainers for Ingress at KubeCon last year, there's a video on YouTube. I probably should pull it up. They sort of talks about where they would like to go, but they need consensus, right? Because that's one of the things is if they just make some new features in the Ingress resource for the Kubernetes project, and then it doesn't get adopted by any of the controllers out there, then what good is it, right? So they need to definitely have that consensus in the community. I think it's moving a little slower than we all wish, but hey, it's open source. Like these are people that have a limited amount of time, so it is what it is. But what I think is going to happen is eventually that what we're talking about now, and Betty at Glue actually was the first one to clue me in on this, is that there's a 2.0 sort of, we're discussing what Ingress Resource 2.0 would look like, right? If there was a version of it, if we never get to version 1, Jerome Pedizzoni was actually talking about this on Twitter the other day, that we're never going to have a V1 Ingress in Kubernetes, at least from his unofficial standpoint, is we're never going to get out of beta because it's not going to have enough features without us just changing a whole bunch of it. So why don't we just change those features now and add the extra functionality, like 301 redirects or URL rewrites, like those sort of basic things that every proxy can do. Maybe those should all be in the spec as well. And of course, when we get into the opinionated stuff about API gateways and maybe, like with traffic, it does let's encrypt automatic cert lookups. So maybe that stuff is extra that doesn't ever go into the official spec. But certainly, I think the community is in agreement that more features should go into the official spec so that there's less reason to go to CRD, right? So at least if when you start out, you can give someone some YAML and say, hey, this should work in your cluster. If you want to get more advanced, then maybe do CRDs. But that's how we're doing it with storage and networking and all these others, is that there's always the base feature set that's sort of built into what Kubernetes can handle, and then there's the custom stuff that the vendors are adding in on top of it. And it's nice. It allows that flexibility. But of course, we all want to get to this utopia where we can swap clouds, we can swap Kubernetes distributions, and everything just works.
Yeah.
But it's all really new. So like we forget that this stuff is, only a few years old. So I feel like we're in a good place. We don't go fast enough.
Does newness get trumped by adoption? Does it because it's so widely adopted, there's like so much momentum behind it, right? So
yeah. Yeah,
It doesn't really matter if it's new because it can break a lot of people's stuff.
yeah. So, well, that's the nice thing about that. You're talking about the API specifically, like the versions of the.
Yeah, I mean, well, not only that, but like just yeah, it feels kind of like Android, right? Like there's like
Like we're gonna have all the. Well, yeah, that's true. On every resource, we have versions, right? So at least we know that if you're specifying the V1 beta 1 of the Ingress resource, that in theory shouldn't break. And if they come out with a V2, that you would have to specify that version.
that's
And
fair.
I think it's great to start out learning that ingress. So in the course, I teach the built-in ingress first. You may not stick with that, but I feel like you should definitely know that built-in functionality for simple DNS routing. Like a lot of us that are relatively small, lower complex environments, I will call those people the solo DevOps people. They probably can get away with just certificate management and DNS routing, right? Just whatever the DNS name is of your API or your web server, that gets its own ingress route, and that'll work on every controller out there that supports the built-in ingress. So when we talk about that built-in ingress, being the Nginx, it doesn't mean you need to choose Nginx, and you can easily choose another one and install it, and that's kind of what we go through with the course. Is I have you running Nginx, and then you swap it out for traffic, and you don't have to touch your ingress resources or your apps or your services or anything. You're simply swapping out the proxy layer, and that's the dream, right? Is that we can just do that. You don't like you realize you've hit a limit in Nginx or HA proxy or something, and you want to try Envoy with Glue or Ambassador, and you can just swap that controller out. Your apps all come right back online, and you're good to go. I think that's obviously what we'd love to see, but to me, it feels kind of like the storage world, where swapping out storage is way harder than we all wish it was. And
Yeah,
it's the same way, I think, with proxies.
and I think we like to bury our head in the sand when it comes to those kind of difficult.
Yeah.
It's just bits on disk somewhere, right?
Yeah. We
But
have the
it's not.
CSI. Certainly, the CSI is going to solve all those problems. But yeah,
You want to? So I know we're coming in hot on time in a bit. Do you want to go over that spreadsheet that you found?
Yeah, so let's show off a couple of things, and then we'll get to some questions, because I know some people have been asking Ingress questions, and we definitely want to get to those. So a couple of things we want to share. So when you go to the documentation for Kubernetes, you see a list of Ingress options, and that is one way to do it inside of the documentation. But one of the other ways is to make sure you're aware of the CNCF landscape website. So it's landscape.cncf.io. And this is for anything that you would want to integrate into Kubernetes. Now, this technically, this landscape is much broader than that, but a lot of it has to do with something working in Kubernetes. So I tend to recommend it to say, hey, look, if you want to come in here and let's just pick a category.
Go to the service proxies or API gateway, bottom right. Since we're talking about that. Whoa.
Let's see.
So,
the interface
needless
is
to
actually
say,
not
Bret,
working.
this is a very large and ever-evolving landscape around Kubernetes in general. And not only that, but on the list of ingress controllers on Kubernetes.io, there's at least 12 of them listed. And each one has their own roadmap, their own feature sets, their own differentiation. Some are open source. Some are, have enterprise editions or community versus enterprise editions with additional features. And the lines between some of these ingress controllers and service mesh technology and API gateways that you might already have in your environment, if it's an enterprise kind of environment where you have like maybe even like proxy appliance, those lines are blurred tremendously when it comes to that.
And the reality is a lot of us probably already have something we've picked, right? We have a data center, we have existing apps. If you're watching this or listening to this, then you certainly have stuff in production. And the the thing that you have probably works with Kubernetes already. So I'm going to guess you're going to stick with that. If you're in the cloud, you're going to be using the cloud load balancers like you've always done. If you're someone in a data center and you've bought an F5 works with this, so you would probably use that. So a lot of times this decision actually is already made for you, and especially if you're doing a Kubernetes distribution that probably comes with its own ingress. A lot of them I think will default to the built-in ingress, meaning Nginx. But like you were talking about, one of the things about Nginx is that it was around way before Kubernetes was. So it needs to technically have this extra program. So there's a controller for Nginx that then configures Nginx and does a HUP on it to tell it to basically recheck the files. So a lot of the newer ones, like Traffic, have designed themselves around being sort of an API-driven update process. So they're not necessarily using files that you reconfigure. You can optionally configure them directly against their own API. And you're talking about the day 2 earlier, and I'm glad you brought that up, about when you change something and that whole configuration has to reload in your proxy. That's something that you have to test, because it's one of those problems that's not relevant. It's not evident until you have 100 or 200 routes and you're suddenly having to change one. And if the process for your proxy is to reload this one really large file, then your proxy may not do well with that, and you may have to test it to make sure that connections continue on. And that's one of the tricks with a lot of these. Even Envoy, I think, sometimes has had these hiccups in the past, because even though it's a newer proxy, reloading it in real time and keeping those connections running, like any connection that's still connected to your servers over TCP, you don't want to terminate that connection every time you renew your settings. So that all is the normal day 2 operation testing stuff that you need to do. And I would say that one of the things you definitely want to do before doing production ingress is to just load up a bunch of those routes, even if they're just fake routes, and start testing consistent connections. If you're just using a web browser, it's not obvious that your backend severed your connection, right? Because browsers are smart enough that when you refresh or go to a new page, it just works. But if you have an app, like most of us will have something where a user has to upload a file, which is a stream of packets, I would always be testing my ingress with something like that running. Or maybe someone's watching a video from your website that's streaming down content from your server. As long as that stream is happening, that's when I would test reloading my routes. Because a lot of teams I see get into trouble, especially with internal app stuff, is that they don't take into account those sessions. And they think everything's sessionless, because when you're testing on your local machine or in a simple CI setup, you don't really experience those stream disconnects. In fact, my talk last year at DockerCon talked a lot about that with Node.js and how you have to really start to get into the devil of the details for that.
Yeah, that's not even to get into like limited bandwidth or mobile connections and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So do you want to go over this spreadsheet and then we can answer some questions or something like that?
Yeah, so let's throw this spreadsheet. I'll put it into the comments, into the chat. So I didn't make this spreadsheet. There's actually a link to the original Medium article from Flant. And I don't really know how updated it is, but it's a nice spreadsheet. We all love spreadsheets on the major Kubernetes ingress providers, the controllers, and the functionality they provide, and maybe some of the areas they miss. And yeah, check that out. Again, I didn't verify all of this stuff to know whether it's current, but what I did notice is that the original article, they put a comment at the bottom that, hey, this is how you reach out to us to get updates on this so that we can make sure it stays current. And if you're in the service mesh, someone out there does one for service mesh too. I'm trying to remember who that was. I don't think it was Sysdig. Anyway, if you just look for service mesh comparison, there'll be another spreadsheet similar to that. And this maybe would help you if you don't have any preference, but I got a feeling a lot of people, they've already got something they're using today, and that's probably going to be what they stick with, but that's just a guess.
Yeah, and I think it also highlights how hard it is to make a decision about this, about which one to go with. there's so much differentiation, especially down here in the bottom versus, like paid options, open source, you know, pure open source kind of options, all these features that you might already have on an existing API gateway in your like non-Kubernetes environment or your just enterprise systems. And if it's like part of your security policy to do, DDoS protection or API authentication or things like that, you might want to take a look at this so that you can see what level of feature sets some of these ingress controllers have. And it might be that you're already behind another device that's doing some of this already for you. And you only need certain parts of certain feature sets that are much more simpler. And if that's the case, maybe as part of your distribution, you still have the access to the default kind of lowercase nginx ingress option. And so maybe that's just enough for what you need to do.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
The consulting answer.
Yeah, it depends, right? I always thought that was a good name for a podcast or something.
It's complicated.
No, it depends.
It depends. I think my going the one I'm going to someday when we make another podcast, because why not have 5 podcasts? I want it to be Kelsey Hightower's Distributed Monolith is the name of the.
I like it.
Yeah,
I had a friend, me and Derek Thurston. If you're out there, shout out. We had a short-lived podcast called Sarcasm as a Service, but we'll maybe resurrect that someday.
Yeah. Well, Container Champs was another one. We have all sorts of good ideas for podcasts. All right, let's get to the questions real quick before we run out of time. Jonathan asks, is there a good development setup with Ingress controllers? I currently use Nginx Ingress with a Minikube tunnel. Then I edit my host file and can use the host locally without having a registered domain. All right, so this actually is a couple of really great questions. The first one is, if you're using something like Minikube or Micro K8s, which are 2 of my 3 recommended development setups for Kubernetes. There's actually now 4, because K3 SUP or Ketchup for K3S is becoming a really good option. But the traditional options were Docker Desktop, Minikube, and Micro K8s. And of course, I kind of talk about Docker Desktop. If you can use it, use it. It's got the most features of all of them. But the one thing that Docker Desktop doesn't do yet is it doesn't provide an automatic ingress out of the box. You can't just do a one-line install without some sort of custom YAML. I do provide that, though, in the course for Nginx and Traffic. But if you're on Minikube, the cool thing is you can just run that Minikube enable ingress, and it will provide you the Nginx already out of the box. You don't have to go learn a bunch of YAML and apply it. So maybe, Jonathan, you're already using that. But the next question you have is, I currently use an ingress with a Minikube tunnel. Then I edit my host file, and I can use the host locally without having a registered domain. So one of the things I would recommend for your domain solution isn't even Docker specific. It's using something like nip.io. There's lots of these options out there. What we call them is wildcard DNSs. And basically, what you can use is you put the IP address of the host, whether it's localhost or some other machine on your network or even on the internet. You make that a part of the DNS name, and then at the end of it, they provide you a wildcard name so that you can type anything in there you want. I actually use this in the course so that you can run 3 different websites locally and use DNS routing inside your ingress. So for this example, if I did, if my local machine on one of my networks was 10.0.0.1, I could type in, nirmal.10.0.0.1.nip.io. So if I type that in my browser, that DNS will always resolve to 10.0.0.1, and that essentially allows me to use all these different names. I can just add whatever names I want on the front of that, and it'll work. So that's like a general development locally tip. If you're ever going to have to deal with local proxies or local DNS routing of any sorts, just do that. And that works with Docker, it works with Kubernetes, it works with anything. And it's not, there's not a security risk here. I actually see a lot of questions on Stack Overflow around this, and it's not using some sort of backdoor or anything trickery. It's just DNS. It just works. There's nothing to worry about there.
Can you run that locally, like in your own environment then?
You mean like provide your own DNS server that does this?
that does this like automatic translation?
You could. What a lot of people do is there's instructions on the internet for because there's so many of these. I think there's another one. Is it XIO? I'm not going to type in random domains, but there's at least 3 or 4 of them. Even the VMware cloud project they have on GitHub, they have their own.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of these that are provided. You can set up your own by just hosting your own DNS, and there are instructions out there on how to do so. I've never seen anyone do it, although I did have one. Now that I think about it, I did have one company that they were pretty secure on their DNS lockdown, like they prevented internet traffic from a bunch of domains. So what they did is they bought a domain so it's a real domain on the internet, and they set all of their stuff to that domain, and they set up their own DNS hosting online that would provide this functionality. I don't actually have a provider that I know that would automatically do this, but I know that when we did it at the time, they set it up. It wasn't that much work for them. So they're just paying for a domain on the internet, and they essentially have their own custom developer domain for this type of thing. So yeah. You can.
I was going to say, I know that registering your own domain can be a pain, but if you are transitioning from local development and you actually do want to test that your apps are going to work on the real internet, that NIPS thing is pretty good, but just get a domain and just put entries in for your private network, or, just to test that, a mobile client or some other device is actually going to be able to resolve that properly.
Yeah. So you're saying make manual A records. Yeah. But instead of doing this wildcard DNS thing, make manual DNS records that go to specific private IPs. Yeah. So they won't work for the rest of the people on the internet, but they'll work on your private network.
Right, because you want to test. Eventually, you want to test all those steps, right? And you need to make sure that it actually works that way.
Yeah,
because that's usually where things start to get wonky.
Yeah. And this is, when I learned this tip back in the day, I thought, wow, I'm never going to have to edit a host file again. So definitely, if you're editing host files, try this solution out. Unless you maybe have to have a very specific domain name to test. Maybe you're testing locally before production. This is kind of related to other things like Inlets from Alex Ellis.
Oh yeah, okay.
So I'll just mention that real quick. Inlets is one of a few solutions that allow you to put a server on the internet, which technically will avoid your firewall and allow you to have a server locally behind a firewall that doesn't have a public open firewall port. And you can have a server on the internet that basically routes or VPNs that traffic to your local machine. And this is what a lot of freelance developers use so that their clients can see the website that they're running locally on their machine. I think that's a common use case that I've seen for years now. And he's developed this fully open source solution that basically allows you to spin up a server anywhere on the internet, run this open source app, and then on your local machine, you just type commands and it will automatically connect what you have locally, specifically to that server. And it's pretty neat. He keeps adding features to it. So if you need that sort of thing, because it also works with Kubernetes, definitely go check that out at Inlets on GitHub.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Just a few more left. All right. Hey, Bret, as both Service Mesh and Ingress works on layer 7, would like to know when Service Mesh is preferred over Ingress controller like traffic. All right. So the rule of Service Mesh is if you don't know you need Service Mesh, then you don't need Service Mesh.
I was going to say something similar. I think every Service Mesh vendor would tell you the same exact thing. I know that one of the solo.io guys does a presentation around. He has like a table on a chart in a presentation where it's like API gateway versus Service Mesh, and it's like the answer you just gave is exactly right. If you're just like, oh, what's the Service Mesh kind of thing, you probably are not ready for it.
Yeah.
Definitely take a look at what features it provides, but there's definitely a trade-off. And I would say that there's a certain level of complexity that you need to be at. I don't know if that's a fair way to say it, but there's a certain level of complexity that Service Mesh helps. And below that threshold, it can you're just adding another layer of abstraction in terms of your networking. So, there's that trade-off, right?
Yeah, and the proxy world is very mature, right? Like we've got decades of proxy experience and when we say proxy for Ingress, we're really talking about that you maybe at most have one proxy running per host, right? That's the traditional model. Or maybe you have it on just a few nodes that are sitting in the DMZ and the rest of your cluster is behind on a separate network with the traffic connected between the two of them. And so only maybe 3 out of your 10 nodes is receiving traffic for the Ingress controller. But when you start talking about service mesh is less about getting that traffic to come into your cluster, and it's more about the visibility and control authorization of everything in your cluster running on HTTP. So it'll double the number of containers you have running just about usually, and it solves a different problem, but it also happens to solve traffic coming in, right? It's meant to solve a bigger set of problems than just I need to route traffic coming into my cluster.
Yeah, I think it's like equivalent to maybe the analogy of standing up Kubernetes to run one container is like too much.
Right.
So like in a vanilla Ingress controller is like using Docker to just run one container.
Yeah.
And a service mesh is kind of like using Kubernetes to run 1,000 containers, right? Like it's like that kind of difference.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, and Traffic is trying to change that a little bit with their new mesh. It's a service mesh called Mesh, and it's using Traffic, and it's using this one proxy per node model instead of the traditional service mesh model, which is a sidecar container that goes in every single pod. I haven't really compared the two thoroughly, but I'm always opting for easy solutions. So maybe when we start talking about maturity, right? Maybe you start with Ingress controller with the default Ingress resource. Then when you need to move beyond that, maybe you consider a custom resource definition and or an API gateway. You might, because API gateways allow more functionality around managing your HTTP. It can translate stuff in real time inside of the protocol stream. And then if that's not enough complexity or not enough stuff that you need to maybe control every pod talking to every other pod and have specific authorization for all that. You don't want to have to build it into your app, and you need more visibility into each part of the networking of all that. Then that's maybe where you go to service mesh, and maybe try mesh first. And if that's not advanced enough, then you maybe go to a more full-fledged one. But that's the problem, like we were saying earlier, is that there is no black and white. It's really hard without having a consulting conversation for us to recommend any one tool or to tell you exactly when you need them. The whole community out there is still talking about helping people decide, right? That's a hard problem that we're all trying to figure out how to help you decide which one to use. But I would always opt for the easiest one first. And the easiest one is the Ingress resource with the built-in Ingress controller. So,
yep.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. You got time for that?
Yeah, it's got to be a quick one though.
A quick one. All right. Someone wants email and Discord to ask you some questions. We're all over the internet. You can ask me on Twitter. You can jump into my course Slack chat if you're in the courses. Like, there's lots of ways you can get in touch with me. But thanks for asking.
And if you're interested in some of the videos I've done, check out Nirmal.io. You can that's a jumping off point for all my ways you can find me.
There you go.
Empathy.
Nirmal.io.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's really got a great talk on strong belief loosely held. So that's my mode of operation is I have strong opinions, but I will change them often. So
that's fair.
Yeah. And I've always operated that way. I just didn't have, until I saw your talk, I didn't have a way to define my mode of operating, really. So
that's good.
Thanks for that talk. Yeah.
No problem.
Well, thanks a lot for being on the show, Nirmal. It's been, as always, it's always great to hang out with you and chit chat. And I'm sure we could talk about this for another 2 hours, but we've got to cut this off at some point. So we'll come back here in a few months and maybe talk about Ingress again and where we are.
Yes.
And with the industry and the recommendations, maybe after KubeCon when we learn some stuff. Because if you're going to be at KubeCon, are you going?
Not sure yet.
Not sure yet,
but I know you're definitely going to be there, right?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to have been picked out of the lottery to talk. So I'm doing a workshop with Jerome.
Yeah.
So
that's all the reason you need to have to go to KubeCon.
Yeah. So it'll be fun. It's going to be in Amsterdam, which is a great city. So I'm looking forward to that. And for all of you that had questions, thanks so much for asking them. If you didn't get your question answered, check me out on Twitter. The Twitter handles are below us on the screen there. Just ask me them online and I will get to them later today. And we'll see you next week back here on YouTube Live. Thanks.
Bye.